Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests and participants, welcome to the webinar on challenges and best practices in human trafficking policy, legislation, investigation, and victim support services for male victims, the fourth in the series. I would like to extend my deep gratitude to Michel and the organizing team, as well as the Sovereign Order of Malta for hosting. My name is Ena Lucia Mariaca Pacheco, and today I am honored to represent the U.S. Council on Violence Against Men and Boys as their co-founder and global ambassador, helping to bring together key individuals from around the world to address these very important topics and hopefully lead to transformative change. It is my pleasure to introduce the distinguished panel of experts who will be sharing their invaluable insights and experiences into this critical field. First, we have the incredible Cristian Eduardo. He is an advocate, speaker, and educator for anti-trafficking initiatives. He is a survivor of international and domestic human trafficking, a Mexican immigrant, a person living with HIV, a member of the LGBTQ+ community, and someone who speaks openly about mental health challenges that he has faced that frequently resulted from trauma. Cristian Eduardo is a survivor leader at New Yorkers for the Equality Model, New York State Anti-Trafficking Coalition, and New Jersey's Coalition Against Human Trafficking, Alliance to End Human Trafficking, and a member of the PAX USA Survivors Council. He is the co-founder of the United Immigrants of New York and Mujeres en Resistencia, coalition of advocates focused on creating awareness and education about gender-based violence, including femicide, and connecting the Spanish-speaking community with accessible resources. Cristian is truly an inspiration in his field, and he brings real change to the United States and abroad. Second, we have Hollywood. She is a researcher and educator with Brave Education and is focused on human trafficking and exploitation. She is a vice chair of the Ottawa Coalition to End Human Trafficking and the chair of the Advocacy Committee. She recently finished her Master's of Legal Studies, and her thesis focused on police responses to sex trafficking in Ontario, Canada. She is currently focused on completing a PhD in sociology with a specialization in criminology, focusing on why young men and boys become traffickers and buyers. Her extensive background in policy and legislation, child welfare, prevention, education, criminal defense, and improving government processes make her a force to be reckoned with. She is currently working on a 5-year research project to bring intersectionality, age-appropriate, and survivor-led, trauma-informed sexual exploitation prevention education to every curriculum and community in Canada. Thank you all for coming here today and sharing your knowledge so that we can truly make a change in the field of human trafficking, especially for male victims that are often forgotten about. Today, we will be uncovering these challenges and lessons learned surrounding policy and legislation, investigation, and victim support, specifically for male victims. And in this webinar, we will embark on a journey to examine the unique complexities in this field and what we can do better as frontline professionals. While discussions on human trafficking typically center on the experience of women and children and girls, the plight of the male victim remains a silent struggle. And this session aims to dismantle those stereotypes, breaking down the social preconceptions, and to address the hurdles that impede human trafficking efforts, especially in cases that involve men. And from the inadequacies in existing policies, legislations, to the nuances in investigating cases with male victims and the challenges inherently providing tailored support services, this webinar will navigate the multifaceted landscape of male trafficking survivors. As we delve into the critical dialogue, our distinguished panel of experts will share insights, research findings, and real-world experiences, fostering a comprehensive understanding of the issues at hand. And together, we aim to inspire a paradigm shift in the discourse surrounding human trafficking, recognizing that men and boys are victims too. Join us as we confront the challenges head-on, striving for more inclusiveness, effective approaches to combating human trafficking, and support for all survivors regardless of gender. And the journey towards eradicating this global crime begins with acknowledging and addressing the unique struggles faced by all victims. And this webinar serves as a pivotal step in that direction. Together, our panelists will shed light on the challenges, lessons learned, and areas of improvement in human trafficking policy, legislation, investigation, and victim support services for male victims. And their expertise will undoubtedly contribute to our understanding and advancement in this vital field. So thank you for joining us, and let's embark on this enlightening journey together.
Hello, my name is Holly Wood, and today I'll be presenting on challenges and best practices in human trafficking policy, legislation, investigation, and victim support services for male victims. I want to start by acknowledging and thanking everyone for being here, for starting this conversation, for continuing this conversation, and for hopefully taking what you have learned here today to your own countries, communities, and organizations to raise awareness about and to help prevent human trafficking and sexual exploitation of young boys and men. I want to thank Ena Lucia and Professor Michel Veuthey for organizing this webinar, and most importantly, for shining a light on the issue of sexual exploitation and trafficking of young boys and men worldwide. I'm going to start by giving you a brief overview of my presentation. Now, I am based out of Ottawa, Ontario, and Calgary, Alberta, so I'll be focusing on human trafficking and sexual exploitation of young boys and men in Canada, and how to change a legal landscape. I'll start by talking about adapting policies and legislation, and then how to make those policies and legislation inclusive and effective, especially in the framework of young boys and men. I'll then use some of my thesis research to discuss our law enforcement responses when investigating human trafficking, and then I'll move on to national and international cooperation and community-based initiatives. As the Vice Chair of the Ottawa Coalition to End Human Trafficking and the Chair of the Advocacy Committee, I'll tell you about how the Coalition is influencing policy and legislation on a micro level to create change on a macro level. Finally, I'll tell you a little bit about the support programs we have here in Canada, the challenges that organizations face, the changes we can make, and what the future can look like from a solutions-based approach focused on young boys and men. To start, I'll be answering the question, how can existing human trafficking policies and legislation be adapted or enhanced to better address the unique challenges faced by male victims? Now, I believe that one of the most important tools that our legal and political systems can wield is that of education. I am a nationally licensed human trafficking prevention educator with Brave Education for Trafficking Prevention, where I help develop and deliver prevention education for grades K to 12, as well as adults and community leaders. From this experience, I advocate for the implementation of exploitation and human trafficking prevention education across all provinces in Canada and across the world. Now, Canada has taken one huge step towards success in this regard, and that specifically is within the province of Ontario, which accounts for an estimated 68% of all the trafficking in Canada. Now, they implemented Program Memorandum 166, the Keeping Students Safe Policy Framework for School Board Anti-Trafficking Protocols on January 31st, 2022. This policy essentially highlights the need for continuing education and prevention efforts geared towards children and youth through Ontario schools, building on their school curriculums. While I don't know if every school in Ontario has implemented this measure, I do know a handful that have. And I think that on a nationwide and even an international scale, we can implement this further. We can take a page out of Ontario's book to implement education across our countries, across our provinces and communities, to have multidimensional, male-focused education and education that focuses on healthy masculinity and raising healthy boys. We all too often talk about toxic masculinity, especially on social media. Now, labeling theory states that people identify with and understand themselves, oftentimes by the labels others give to them. So we need to reverse this narrative and shift the conversation from toxic masculinity to healthy masculinity. And I think this can be highlighted in educative initiatives on an international scale. I think we also need to look directly at victimology debates and literature around who is a victim. While there is a growing body of literature and research that discusses victimhood, it's important to challenge perceptions of victimology so that it includes men and boys. So, for instance, in Canada, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a huge increase in the sextortion of boys and men, especially in Western provinces like Saskatchewan and Alberta. Now, an October 2023 news article, which I have attached in the resources for this webinar, stated that the Calgary police in Alberta have received 195 reports of sextortion in 2023 so far. And this is compared to 184 reports total in 2022. And again, this is only from October, so there were about 4 months left in the year, and we're only anticipating an increase in those numbers. Therefore, I think it's incredibly important to increase research and conversation around the fact that boys and men can be victims too, and that we continue to work and integrate research into actionable items such as curriculums to shift the narrative of victimhood and shine a light on the realities of our young boys and men. Finally, we can improve efforts to protect communities and youth. Yes, legislation and policy, action plans, strategies are important, but it's also incredibly important to go beyond these action plans. Now, we're doing well, as I mentioned, in Canada. However, education would be the initiative that I would approve upon, namely so that we can put up more protective barriers for our children and youth in our communities. This might include having hard conversation with our children about the dangers and about how to interact online safely. Now, while the topic of sex is taboo, I do believe that we can have age-appropriate conversations about consent and safe people, safe places, and safe decision making. All of this policy and legislation we put forth should be creating a safe space for men and boys to speak up and share their truth. Now, when I look at accountability, when I look at our national strategies and our provincial action plans, the first thing that comes to mind for me where we are lacking is third-party oversight. So oftentimes in Canada, we come up with an action plan or a strategy that has a 5-year timeline. For instance, our national strategy to combat human trafficking ends in early 2024, and I have not seen a single effort or any type of communication from the federal government stating that they're going to renew these efforts, they're going to update the action items, or do anything else, or even provide an update on where we currently stand in terms of where those action items are on a scale of being completed and not completed. You do see some things where it says project underway or committee has been appointed in charge of this action item, but I think that we need to bring in a third party who is not associated with that government committee at all, who oversees the operations, who gives you a timeline and says, this is what we're accomplishing in year 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We also need to look at these timelines on national and provincial strategies. Much like we see in federal elections, you have 4 years to get something done. What is feasible? What can you do in 4 or 5 years that's going to make a difference? And what does each year of completing that item look like? I also think that we can't have open-ended timelines on these because it is so important to recognize that these issues are paramount. They're happening to our children every day. In Canada, within 10 blocks of where you're sitting, someone is being trafficked. So we absolutely need to focus on getting these things done in a timely manner. And again, having that third-party oversight to make sure they are done and done correctly. We also need to shift narratives around victimhood and who is a victim because current efforts in Canada do not highlight the fact that our young boys and men are affected by the crime of human trafficking and sexual exploitation too. Now, victims' rights and voices are an incredibly big piece of the puzzle when working towards preventing and ending trafficking, not only in Canada, but also worldwide. I'm going to touch on a bunch of elements on this as we go, but from a policy and legal standpoint, it's important for Canada to implement legal responses that are survivor-led, trauma-informed, and intersectional in approach. So for instance, Canada's national strategy proposed a National Survivor Advisory Committee to advise on and help draft legislation and policy relating to the crime of trafficking. However, no movement has been made on this. In 2019, the Canadian government announced a National Survivor Advisory Committee, but as of December 2023, no one has been elected to chair or be a part of that committee. Ontario has a provincial survivor table, but from my conversations with the survivors on those tables, they've met twice in recent years and there's nothing to show for those meetings. And for survivors, it felt more like a meet and greet rather than an opportunity to act. It is so important to amplify survivors' voices in all of the work we do, whether it's policy, legislation, or otherwise. Everything we do should have the rights and voices of victims at the forefront. Now, finally, I'm going to talk about amending old laws and implementing new ones. So from a lot of the legal research that I've done, we ultimately need to create a legal system that evolves at the same pace as the crime of human trafficking. Human trafficking is always changing, but unfortunately our law is not. Now, the Palermo Protocol came into effect in 2000. Canada's criminal code provisions relating to human trafficking were enforced in 2005, and we've seen a few amendments here and there, but there are always legal loopholes in the wording of our criminal code provisions relating to the crime of human trafficking, and those are gaps that we need to focus on filling. Now, I'm not doing a PhD in law, although sometimes I wish I was, but I always tell people if I were doing a PhD in law with a focus on human trafficking, I would look at how to do a complete reconfiguration of Canadian law, including the criminal code, most importantly. This would mean looking at where our current law stands, where those loopholes that we so often identify are, how to implement new laws, how to amend old laws, and ultimately to analyze if our laws are biased against male victims. So just a quick statistic for you, currently in Canada, 52% of all human trafficking charges in Canada end in lesser charges, such as criminal harassment, sexual assault, or something that does not hold as harsh a punishment as human trafficking. Next, I'm going to talk about how to make policy and legislation inclusive and effective, specifically looking at the question, what specific provisions or amendments could be considered to ensure inclusivity and effectiveness in combating trafficking while also safeguarding the rights of male victims. So one thing that I worked on was Bill S224, and I recently spoke to this bill in June 2023 before the Justice Committee. And it was a bill that looked to remove the element of fear. So currently in Canada, a victim or survivor of trafficking must prove that they were in a state of fear that meant they could not leave their trafficker. Now, if anyone here knows anything about the victimology associated with human trafficking, you know that a lot of trafficking victims actually have an intimate and personal relationship with their trafficker, meaning they do not fear them. Now, this can ultimately lead to people not being convicted for the crime. So I recommend looking at drafting new legislation, as Bill S224 was booted off the table recently and will no longer proceed to actually become enforced law. But I think we need to look at drafting a new Bill S224 or something close to it that removes that element of fear. I also think we need to look at the bigger picture of the burdens we put on victims who want to be involved in prosecuting and convicting their human traffickers. And the other thing we need to look at is criminal record expungement for survivors and victims of sex trafficking and other forms of exploitation, especially men and boys. Now, to create inclusive and elaborate strategies, we need to focus on drafting and implementing strategies, laws, and policies that acknowledge the intersectionality of victimhood. Oftentimes in the research that I've seen in Canada and worldwide, we do not focus enough on the fact that a lot of victims of trafficking are boys and men. A lot of them come from the 2S LGBTQ plus community. And unfortunately, our law and policy kind of let them fade into the background. So we really need to focus on forward thinking that includes everyone from, again, an intersectional perspective. We also need to look at implementing laws and policies that do not create bias against certain groups in society, such as boys and men. Again, going back to that discussion on toxic masculinity versus healthy masculinity, raising healthy boys. We need to focus on writing policies and legislation that support that shift in the current narrative. From a research and statistics standpoint, we need to look at increased research and statistics on male victims. There are a lot of groups within the UN, within Canada, within Parliament that focus on the targeting of young women and girls, Indigenous women and girls. We need to focus on male victims. We need to have working groups and independent studies on male populations and the victimization of male populations, especially in relation to the crime of human trafficking and sexual exploitation. Further, we need to focus research on prevention and healthy masculinity, raising healthy boys, reaching our kids before the average age of recruitment, having wraparound support and services so that they know where to go and who they can reach out to in times of trouble. Finally, we need to use the research that will come in the future, such as Ena's incredible research. We need to use that research when we're drafting and implementing laws and policies. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about is investigating human trafficking. I personally wrote and am writing my thesis for my master's on law enforcement responses to sex trafficking and sex work in Canada. I'm focused on the province of Ontario since it accounts for such a large number of human trafficking in Canada. But for this specific section, I'm going to answer the question, investigating human trafficking cases involving male victims often presents distinct challenges. What innovative strategies and collaborative approaches can analysts or law enforcement agencies adopt to overcome those challenges and effectively identify, investigate, and prosecute traffickers exploiting male victims? So number one of the barriers that I've seen the most in my work is victim participation. The fact that a lot of victims and survivors of human trafficking do not want to participate in the legal process. So we need to increase victim participation, which would in, implement something that removes burdens on victims who choose to pursue that legal action. This can include not having to go to court and submitting a victim impact statement that is enough, because a lot of defense attorneys do not think it is enough. It's not putting people on the stand. It's doing more than putting a screen in front of them when they're sitting in a courtroom straight across from their trafficker. We also need to do more to protect the identity of people who do come forward to report human trafficking. Now, we have a lot of laws in Canada that protect youth, but we also need to think about men and boys who decide to report later on in life above the age of 18. Number one, we need to deal with social biases against sexual crimes. So we need to tackle those stigmas around sexual crimes and victimhood on the front lines. We need care teams. In Canada, we have something called a child at risk of exploitation team. We have them in 2 cities in Ontario. It's expanding across Canada, but we need them everywhere. And that is a team that is law enforcement, children's aid or children's protection workers, as well as Indigenous children protection workers. And they go out together in the community and they try to identify at-risk children and youth, and then they try to intervene before trafficking occurs. Again, we also need to increase conversation about the fact that anyone can be a victim of human trafficking, especially boys and men. One of the best things that I've seen in Canada is an increase in survivor-led positions within police services. So we now have a ton of lived experience experts in Canada, such as Simone Bell. And what they do is they amplify survivors' voices in all of the decisions that you see being made on the front lines of police work. But within this specific area, we need to focus on amplifying male victims' voices through lived experience experts. So we need more males to speak up and feel safe in a role like that. And then we also need to increase cross-sectoral training and education, which would increase funding for law enforcement and other criminal justice actors for education and training on what human trafficking looks like and how we can resolve the issue and hopefully prevent it from happening again. Next, I'm going to talk about national and international cooperation and community-based initiatives. So how can national or international cooperation play a role in enhancing investigative efforts in cases involving male victims? Additionally, what partnerships and community-based initiatives can be fostered to create a more inclusive and supportive environment for male victims of human trafficking and sexual exploitation? So first and foremost, when we look at internationally binding policy and legislation, I think we need to analyze our international obligations under different protocols and covenants and conventions. Countries need to understand that when you ratify something such as the Palermo Protocol, you have a duty to act, a duty to implement. And we've seen this in Canada through the Canadian Criminal Code, but there's a lot of academic debate about whether or not that has been effective. We also need to look at the enforcement of internationally binding policy and legislation. Another big thing that I like to talk about is micro to macro, high impact collaboration. So collaborating on a micro level to create change on a macro level, starting where we are and growing from there. So again, the Ottawa Coalition to End Human Trafficking is a great example of this. We are interdisciplinary committee made up of about 40 people within our steering committee. We come from all walks of life. We are frontline organizations and agencies. We are police. We are support workers. We are children's aid workers. We are survivors. We are mothers of survivors. We are students who are studying this issue or individuals who have written a lot of literature on these issues. We work together to propose solutions, and then we go to Parliament Hill once a month and we produce these annual reports, we write briefs in support of legislation, and we present to parliamentary actors to give insight on what we're seeing on the front lines and what policy and legislation can do to resolve some of the issues that we see on the ground on those front lines. I also believe that building communities of support is incredibly important. So building strong communities of support for youth who are at risk of or actively being trafficked, as well as those reintegrating into society after being trafficked, so that they know where to go, they know who they can talk to, they know what sort of services are out there, and then they can reach out whenever they are ready or whenever they're in need. Finally, we need to talk about breaking down silos. So building a longer table rather than a higher fence. There's a lot of competition in Canada for federal and provincial funding. We need to talk about that. We need to realize that we are all working towards the same common goal. And regardless of who has funding, we all want to see the same thing. So we can't keep working in these silos. We need to share what we're learning and what we're seeing, what our research is producing. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about community support programs. So male victims of human trafficking may encounter barriers in accessing appropriate support services. How can victim support programs be tailored to address the unique needs of male survivors, including psychological and reintegration support? So first and foremost, for me, that comes down to having male-focused programs that are designed for and built by men, with the needs and stories of men at the forefront of these organizations. We also need to focus on adequate funding. So that would be renewing government funding for strategies, law enforcement support services, and organizations in a timely manner. So for instance, this is absolutely heartbreaking, but recently the provincial government in Ontario decided to cut $7 million in funding for housing for survivors and victims of sex trafficking and human trafficking more broadly. So that's $7 million that many organizations that have worked so hard to provide those resources and meet those needs have now lost. And we need to look at the bigger picture of where is our funding going? How often does it need to be renewed? Looking at renewing that funding 6 months ahead of time or having something in place so you just hit a button the day it expires and it is renewed. We really need to get the ball rolling on renewing that funding and ensuring that the organizations that are doing such hard work on the front lines have the resources and the financial means to provide the services that are so desperately needed. We also need wraparound care and services. This is focused on strengths, needs-driven, and individualized care from exit to re-entry. So we need more wraparound care and services. We need more organizations and agencies who are able to provide this individualized approach to care for trafficking survivors and victims, especially men and boys. And we need to focus not only, again, on prevention, but also what do they do after exit? What do they do when they are reintegrating into society? We have a handful of programs here. However, they're not well funded, and unfortunately, they're just not able to accommodate the high number of victims and survivors that we see. So we definitely need to look at increasing the amount of services and resources we have. Finally, we need to look at forward-thinking initiatives and plans. So having exit plans that include financial assistance, financial literacy education, as well as housing and other community supports. Again, psychological reintegration support specific to men and boys, specific to every population that this crime is touching. And if we're looking at numbers and crunching numbers from a financial standpoint, we need to make sure that it is long-term financial assistance and support, financial literacy education that focuses on educating victims and survivors on how to manage their money and how to move forward after such a terrible, terrible thing has happened to them. We also need to look at housing because a lot of the communities in Canada are facing a housing crisis right now. We need to look at other community supports. This could be substance abuse support, this could be mental health support, everything like that. We need to have forward-thinking initiatives and plans that focus on not just the next year or 2 years, but the next 10 years or 15 years of a survivor's life. This, of course, needs to be trauma-informed and intersectional in approach, and again, needs to be survivor-led and informed, and needs to work with people who know the reality of the situation. That's why lived experience experts are so important in the work that we do. So this is about it for me. There's a lot more that I'm happy to share with anyone interested, but the key points are that there is a way forward. For Canada, this means more research on male victims of human trafficking and exploitation. It means intersectional, survivor-led, and trauma-informed approaches. It means creating a legal system that evolves at the same pace as the crime of human trafficking. It includes improving frontline responses and funding for education and prevention education. It also means increased funding for support programs that are so vital in every step of a victim or survivor's journey back to who they are. Thank you so much for being here, for listening. Please feel free to ask me any questions in the chat, to email me. I will go back to my main slide here, which gives you my email. I'm very happy to touch base with anyone else. And again, thank you so much for being here.
In closing, I would like to express my deep gratitude to our esteemed guest, Holly, Cristian, for sharing their profound insights and experiences with us today. Their dedication to develop prevention policies, changing legislation, and improving investigations is truly commendable. As we begin our questions and answer period, I would encourage all of us to reflect on the critical importance of this collective effort in this fight against exploitation and trafficking. The knowledge and expertise shared here today provide us a solid foundation for us to build upon, and we work tirelessly to create a better world for all victims and survivors, regardless of their gender, ethnicity, age, or community groups. Let us remember that this battle is ongoing and it requires continuous collaboration, research, and advocacy. Each one of us has an important role to play to ensure the safety and well-being of all victims and survivors of human trafficking around the world. I urge you to take the knowledge gained from this webinar and turn it into action. Whether you work in policy, legislation, investigations, or any other fields, your contribution matters. Together, we can make meaningful impact and contribute to the world where human trafficking is eradicated. And so, Holly, would you like to let us know what you've been doing this year?
Yeah, so as mentioned in my presentation, I acted as a witness in support of Bill S-224, which would have removed the burden of fear that is necessary to prove human trafficking under the Criminal Code of Canada. As I said, that bill did not go through. It was pushed off the table after being approved in the Senate, so just in the final stages. We're working on redrafting a new version of that. I've also been working a ton on education. So I've been educating in several provinces across Canada in our local classrooms and communities, as well as with adults and community leaders, parliamentary staff, etc. I'm working on a 5-year project with My Tax and Brave Education that would try to bring age-appropriate and inclusive human trafficking prevention education into every community and corner of Canada. I've written briefs to several parliamentary offices in support of research reports. So some of those are women, girls, and gender diverse individuals in terms of those being sexually exploited. There, we actually highlighted the need for research on boys and men and proposed an additional study be done on that. I also wrote a letter to the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, which pushed for essentially a 72-hour hold on youth who present with signs of human trafficking to ensure that they're able to have an exit plan or strategy in place. Also looking at culturally inclined care, educating healthcare staff, and looking at the different admission standards that we do have for potential victims and survivors of human trafficking. We know that 88% of them, human trafficking victims and survivors are in our hospitals and have seen healthcare staff, so we're working on improving that. And then I also recently wrote a letter to the Premier of Ontario to focus on bringing that care team, the Children at Risk of Exploitation team, into the Ottawa community. So those are some of the things that I've been lucky enough to work on. And then also 2 pieces of legislation that I've helped draft that are going to be in Canadian Parliament soon.
That's absolutely incredible, amazing work, the both of you. Survivors are. Thank you so much. Holly, what are some challenges, lessons learned, or best practices that you would like to highlight?
Yeah, I think the biggest one for me is collaboration. I think we really are improving our efforts to collaborate in Canada, but given our lack of funding, a lot of the organizations that I work with, especially in Ontario and even just Canada-wide, honestly, there's almost a hierarchy where there are some organizations that get a lot of funding, and then you have, a lot of frontline workers and organizations who don't have a lot of funding. And what you're seeing is we're working in these silos where we keep our projects and our research kind of hidden or quiet until it's done. And I think what's so important, and in the 5-year research project I'm working on, is to be constantly sharing our knowledge, regardless of that funding, regardless of which organization you work for. We're all aiming towards the same goal, which is preventing and ending human trafficking. So we do need to be working together. We need to be speaking with one another, sharing, going to these webinars and conferences and breaking down those silos, shaking hands, exchanging stories, exchanging research, that sort of thing.
Can you tell me about any toolkit items, programs, websites, initiatives that you would like to highlight? So let's go on to Holly.
I'm going to start by sharing 3 of my favorite kind of pieces of literature. So the first is a book by Katrine Roots. It talks about human trafficking policy, policing, prosecution in Canada. So I've dropped the link there, a great read. And then Tamaya Nagy's book, Out of the Shadows, was actually the book that kind of prompted me to study this and to work in this field. And then when I started in academia, Katrine Roots' PhD dissertation, which I have also put in the chat, was a big driving force for me. So those were kind of the 3 big pieces of literature that really put me into this field and continue to drive my passion every day. I wanted to also state that there's a bunch of stuff that is coming out on the Canadian front. So I'm currently in the midst of writing a letter to the House of Commons on the National Survivor Advisory Committee that I mentioned. That will be coming out in a couple of weeks. I'm also working on a letter to the Ontario government on the recent $7 million housing fund that was cut. I believe that is being cut starting in March, so we're trying to prevent that from happening or find additional funding that can fill that gap. I also want to highlight the coalition's work. So we have our annual report coming out on human trafficking in Ottawa. We have a COVID-19 report, which will chronicle the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, policies, regulations on service providers and their clientele in Ottawa. And then I also have a community of practice coming out with the coalition, which will be a giant book that highlights all the services available from Cornwall, Ontario to Trenton, Ontario. So such a vast geographical scope there. I'm writing a chapter of a book right now on Canada's anti-human trafficking measures, assessing progress over the past 20 years. That'll be out next September. I have an article coming out in 2024 with the McGill Law Journal. I put it on my blog, so you can read it there. It's called Unpacking the Power of Legal Definition, Changing the Legal Narrative Around Sex Trafficking and Sex Work in Canada. And then my thesis on police in Ontario and responses to sex trafficking in Ontario is coming out in April. And then I also have a critique of a human rights declaration coming out in February or March. So there's a lot of great literature that I know is coming out. Be sure to check your international human trafficking journals and keep up with Canada, because I think we're making vast improvements. And I think there's a lot coming down the pipeline.
That is incredible work, the two of you. My goodness. I would like to applaud that. And so I would also like to highlight one thing before we finish. I'd like to highlight the U.S. Council on Violence Against Men and Boys, which is a dynamic and diverse collective of professionals and live experts. Our vision is to pave a way for a safer and more secure future for boys and men. And our shared mission revolves around preventing trauma and violence that can impact males. And we will achieve this through groundbreaking advancements in the realm of public health and prevention of violence. So my team and I are putting together a global conference next year in Miami, Florida in June 2024 called the International Conference on Violence Against Men and Boys. This conference is a transformative public health intervention, and it is a groundbreaking educational and capacity building event that seeks to address the often overlooked issue of violence against men and boys, which will focus on reframing violence as a health issue. And this conference aims to equip the individuals from the private sector, government, healthcare, social services, criminal justice with the practical knowledge and skills and tools necessary to prevent and respond effectively to various forms of violence experienced by males.